Is there evidence in Western religious literature that corroborates the activities of the Anunnaki as it is found in the numerous myths, poems and hymns of Mesopotamia? These Sumerian sources deal with the same events: the creation of humanity, its subsequent modification into a modern human or Homo sapiens, the existence of god-kings, the coming of the deluge, and many of the following events of recorded history. There is a large body of religious literature besides the Book of Genesis, which deals with the pre-deluge era. Sources such as the 3 books of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Gnostic teachings, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Haggadah or the oral tradition of the Jews, the rabbinical writings, the works of Josephus, and many works of the Pseudepigrapha. Much of what is not intelligible in these ancient religious writings is explained in part in the extensive library of available Sumerian, Babylonian, and other cuneiform inscriptions. It will be demonstrated that the scriptures and Sumerian literature, regarded in a historical context and stripped of their spiritual and mythological verbiage, support and augment each other remarkably. Sumer was the fountainhead for the events and stories of the Old Testament and other Western religious writings. Much as biblical scholars have tried to avoid or cloud the origin of the Old Testament, the historical facts clearly show that its antecedents are in the Valley of Mesopotamia. The Sumerian culture, which can be traced as far back as the beginning of the 4th millennium BC, was the source of all the myths of Middle Eastern civilizations that followed, such as the Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian people who inherited much of the Sumerian culture. This culture was subsequently transferred to the west, to Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, and Anatolia. The actual language of the Sumerians was superseded relatively earlier by Akkadian, a Semitic tongue. Sumerian is non-Semitic and its origins are unknown. It seems to have no affinities at all and to have suddenly appeared on Earth out of nowhere. The Akkadians and Sumerians later intermingled and eventually formed a fusion of the 2 languages. From this Sumerian-Akkadian milieu evolved the Semites and eventually the Hebrews or Jews. The Hebrews did not invent their language or literary forms. Their culture was inherited from the older Mesopotamian and Canaanite civilizations. It should be more widely realized that when those famous biblical figures Noah and Abraham lived, there was no such thing as a Hebrew in existence. Both the Jews and Arabs traditionally claimed descendancy from Abraham, who was neither Jew nor Arab, but a resident of the city of Ur in Mesopotamia. The earliest reference in the Old Testament said to show Abraham's alleged Hebrew ancestry is an error perpetuated by mistranslation. In their eagerness to prove Hebrew antiquity, translators have incorrectly referred to Abraham as such in Genesis 14. The context in which this reference appears is the invasion of the eastern kings into Canaan, and Abraham's reaction when his nephew Lot is taken prisoner. As the text goes, the invaders seized all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food and departed, taking with them Lot, the son of Abraham's brother, together with his possessions. He had been living in Sodom. A fugitive brought the news to Abraham the Hebrew, who was camping at the terebinths of Mamre the Amorite, the kinsman of Eshcol and Aner, these being the confederates of Abraham. Evidently Abram, was a stranger in the land at the time. He had just migrated from the city of Ur in Mesopotamia. Manifestly, both he and Lot were visitors or travelers. The translation of the word Ibri as Hebrew has no linguistic support. The root bra means to pass through or to cross. Hence, Ibri, as it appears in the text of Genesis, would mean one who is passing through or a visitor. In reality, the news was brought to Abraham that his nephew, friend and fellow traveler had been captured by the invaders. Interestingly, in the Ethiopic linguistic traditions, in some of the oldest of all modern-day civilizations, the word bir means dollar bill. Since a dollar bill passes from hand to hand or crosses from one person to another, it is easy to see how this linguistic root word still influences even modern languages. The Semitic Ibri is obviously related to the Akkadian Ibru, from which it probably derived. In the Akkadian version of the Gilgamesh epic, his friend Enkidu, with whom Gilgamesh shares most of his adventures, is Ibru. The Chicago Assyrian Dictionary defines it as a relationship between persons of the same code of behavior and the obligation of mutual assistance. This definition fits the situation of Abraham and Lot perfectly. Abraham's subsequent activities in the land of Canaan leave no doubt that he was a stranger and a visitor. For example, after his battle with the invading army, he had to report to Melchizedek, the king of Salem, where he paid 10% of all the loot recovered. Later, when Abraham eventually settled in the land of Canaan near Gerar, it was at the sufferance of Abimelech, the Philistine king. The latter also controlled the lands around Gerar and Beersheba. Abraham had a later confrontation at Beersheba with Abimelech, who made it clear that he was in command of the land, backing up his claim with General Phichol's troops. Abraham later had to purchase a plot of land to bury his wife Sarah. He paid 400 shekels of silver for this land, a tremendous amount of money for a small piece of land containing a cave. While this sum was abnormally high, Abraham, as a foreigner, was in no position to demur. These activities of Abraham were not the actions of a native, and Abraham lived among the Canaanites with their forbearance. If not the law of the land, it was the custom that a stranger or alien could not own landed property. This probably accounts for the high price that Abraham had to pay. The borrowed legends of the Old Testament. The oldest part of the Bible, Genesis chapters 1 through 6, which deal with the antediluvian period, was not written down in its present form much earlier than 800 BC. On the other hand, most of the Sumerian stories and legends were composed and published about 2500 BC, or not long afterward. The cuneiform tablet versions reported events that took place before the deluge and activities just after the event. The uniqueness of the Old Testament comes under critical scrutiny since there is nothing here that cannot be found in the ancient myths and literature of Mesopotamia and the land of Canaan. Suppose the activities of Abraham can be dated to about 2100 BC, and his antecedents are in Mesopotamia. In that case, all the Old Testament events which took place before Abraham and the deluge must have had their origin among the indigenous people. What is not often perceived is that the Jews had a vast store of creation and other myths wholly unknown to us at their disposal, from which they borrowed selectively. For instance, we know that the Eden of the Bible was located in the river delta region of Mesopotamia. The story of the creation of Adam is a Sumerian account. The story of the Ark, the deluge and Noah came from Sumerian accounts. In fact, the deluge story was not limited to the Middle East, but was universally known. There are also Ugaritic, northern Canaan parallels to the Hebrew Bible. The story of Daniel was taken from a North Canaan poem dated as far back as 1500 BC. The Ugarit epic of Keret deals with the capture of a bride of King Keret by a distant king. It later became the Helen of Troy motif. But more importantly, it is the source of the stories of Genesis 12 and 20, where twice Abraham had to get his wife Sarah back from the hands of other kings. The story of Job comes from a Babylonian poem about a virtuous man named Tabu Utul Bel, who was sorely afflicted for some inscrutable reason and tormented by the gods. The story of Jonah has many origins and apparently was universal, for Hercules was swallowed by a whale at precisely the same place, Joppa. Persian legends tell of their hero Jamahid, devoured by a sea monster that later vomited him safely upon the shore. A similar tale appears in India in the epic classic Samadev Bhatta, where Saktadeva was swallowed by a fish and later escapes. The story of Samson is so strange and foreign to Hebrew lore as to indicate that it was borrowed in toto from Canaanite mythology. In fact, his name is derived from Shamash, the Canaanite sun god who ruled Lebanon. There are so many parallels that there is no question of contemporary borrowing by the Hebrews. How then did this influence penetrate the Bible so completely? Sometime during the 2nd millennium BC, the Babylonian script, language, and literature permeated the lands west of Mesopotamia. Babylonian had become the diplomatic language of the Middle East, so that correspondence between princes of Syria, Phoenicia, and Palestine with their Egyptian overlords were carried out in Babylonia. Therefore, to learn the Babylonian writing and language, these people needed to study their literature, and for this purpose, texts were required. Among the tablets discovered at Tel Amarna in Egypt were copies, in the form of school exercises, the Babylonian stories of Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, and the tale of Adapa, the mortal who was misled into refusing the food and water of immortality. So it is not unreasonable to assume that many Sumerian and Babylonian traditions, such as creation and deluge stories, were also known to the Hebrews, or at least to their leaders. When he left Ur in the valley of Mesopotamia, Abraham presumably brought these Sumerian traditions with him. His father, Terah, was a high priest in the government of Ur, and would undoubtedly have had an intimate knowledge of Sumerian culture. Obviously, Sumerian tales of the gods of heaven and earth, the creation of man, and the deluge were the fountainhead from which nations of the ancient world drew their knowledge and beliefs. The Invisible Bible. It is now generally accepted that the Old Testament is a condensed version of our early history. It is also evident that the Bible is the result of a long selection process, and for that reason excludes a large number of sacred texts and other ancient writings. Many Christian texts or apocrypha and Jewish texts called pseudepigrapha were left out, mainly due to the fierce political and religious rivalry in the early days between sects like Jews, Christians, and Gnostics. In fact, the pseudepigrapha was lost entirely from the transmitted heritage documents that stem from 200 BC to 200 AD. The term pseudepigrapha has evolved from the Greek meaning writings with false superscriptions. Still, scholars use the word today not because it denotes something spurious, but rather because the term has been inherited and is now universally used. What was retained in books of the Old Testament after centuries of emendation by the priesthood was a highly introspective version of the vast amount of literature available. Manuscripts such as the 3 books of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and others tell a different story of the creation of Adam and Eve and the activities of the antediluvian patriarchs. These lost books of the Bible explain many of the puzzles and inconsistencies of the Old Testament. The Gnostic literature was left entirely out of the scriptures. Being serious rivals to the early Christians, the Gnostics were harassed and utterly defeated, and their literature was consigned to oblivion. In the early Christian church, the most systematic and organized Gnostic cult was Manichaeism, which spread from Mesopotamia through Asia Minor to North Africa and the European territories of the Roman Empire. In the first 4 centuries, Gnosticism was so popular that it posed a serious challenge to the early Christian church. In the 2nd century, Valentinus, a prominent Gnostic thinker, sought selection as pope in Rome and almost succeeded. This marked the high point of Gnosticism. Had he not been defeated, one wonders what that significant influence Saint Augustine, born a Manichaean, would have later done, and probably changed the history of the Catholic Church. As a result, Gnostic texts disappeared or were left uncopied, which achieved the same end. Until recently, all that was available of Gnostic literature were the refutations to the Gnostics by the early Christian fathers. Then, in 1945, extensive Gnostic treatises were found in earthenware jars in Egypt at a small town called Naj Hammadi. The find was as significant to biblical research as that of the Dead Sea Scrolls to Palestine. It is in the Gnostic tracts that the existence of the serpent gods is clearly indicated. Eve gave life to Adam, and the serpent in the garden is a noble and virtuous creature. It is easy to see why the Manichaeans were persecuted so avidly. Even so, as a religion, it persisted in Europe as late as the 13th century. The Albigensians in southern France were the last stronghold of the Manichaeans. However, they were exterminated by Pope Innocent III, who organized a military crusade against them. It was then that the Inquisition came into being with the primary mission to crush the remnants of the Gnostic heresies. Thus, as more and more ancient sources are found, it is abundantly clear that an enormous amount of information from ancient sources has been omitted from the Old Testament. Analysis of these sources provides us with insight into the book of Genesis, particularly the period before the deluge, which is covered by only 6 short chapters of the book. Although camouflaged in religious and symbolic terms, these ancient documents describe the organization and operation of the Sumerian gods and their activities here on Earth. The plural gods of the Old Testament. It is generally agreed that 2 traditions make up the Old Testament books: the older or Elohist tradition, which refers to the deity in generic terms, and the priestly tradition where the deity is called Yahweh, often called Jehovah due to a mistranslation from the Greek Septuagint. The 2 main streams are intertwined throughout the Old Testament and sometimes exist side by side, as for example in Genesis there are 2 versions of the creation. The deity is called El, plural Elohim, some of the time, and Yahweh the rest of the time. Biblical scholars agree that the usage of Yahweh appears to be an anachronism and may have been inserted at later times. Hebrew Elohim is grammatically a plural form and is often translated as God at times, but also gods or divine beings at other times, mainly because the text is often ambiguous. Generally, the name for the deity is El, which appears to be the generic term for the deity in Western Semitic and Biblical Hebrew. It apparently was borrowed from the pantheon of indigenous people of the land of Canaan. Who then was this El, who was the supreme deity of the Canaanites? As the ruling god of the Western Semitic pantheon, the leading Sumerian deity Enlil was transcribed syllabically as Ilulu, then became Ili in Akkadian or Semitic, and later El in Hebrew. El thus became the name for Enlil, the supreme being in Palestine, and carried over into the Old Testament. While the rest of the world believed in many gods, the compilers of the Old Testament tried to proclaim a faith in one God. Despite these monotheistic attempts, however, there remain many instances where the biblical narrative falls into the plural form of El or Elohim. In Genesis, for example, when the notion to create Adam is brought up, the words used are all plural, and Elohim, plural, said, "Let us make man in our image and after our likeness." Later, in the Garden of Eden, when the serpent is tempting Eve, he says, "You are not going to die. No, the gods, Elohim, will know that the moment you eat it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be the same as the gods, Elohim, in telling good from the bad." Again later, after the fall, the deity complains, "Now that man has become like us, discerning good from the bad." In other cases, the deity often addressed remarks aside as if to other members of the celestial staff. Even after the deluge, when man was erecting a tower in Babel, the deity remarked to an associate, "Let us then go down and confound their speech." Therefore, notwithstanding attempts by early editors to proclaim a policy of monotheism, evidence of a pantheon has not been completely erased from the text of the Old Testament. The problem of the usage of Yahweh. According to the book of Exodus, the appellation Yahweh did not come into use until the time of Moses, for Moses is told by the deity that, "I am Yahweh, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name Yahweh." Scholars agree that the name Yahweh was a later addition by priestly scribes. The tetragram YHWH, or Yahweh, became the distinctive personal name for the God of Israel, and is used most frequently throughout the Old Testament to represent the deity. The origin of Yahweh is unknown, and while many explanations for its meaning have been proposed, the most logical seems to be that the divine name is a form of the verb to be, or HWH, thus meaning the one who is. This is manifest in Exodus 3, where Moses queries the Lord on his real name so that he can inform the tribes of Israel who wish to know what to call their God. God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, I am has been sent to you." This verse has given scholars all kinds of problems, and it is footnoted in most translations of the Bible with the caveat that it can also mean "I am what I am" or "I will be what I will be." Its ambiguity is probably because it is a liturgical epithet. It means exactly what it says. I am the one who is or who exists. In ancient times, divine names were held to have intrinsic power in themselves, and specific appellations could only be used by the priesthood. In the Sumerian and Babylonian pantheon, only descriptive names are used. The actual names of the gods are not known. Yahweh, or the One Who is probably an attempt by Hebrew priests to substitute an innocuous name for that of the deity, thereby diffusing any possible harmful consequences. This is also found in the rabbinical tradition, where the name Yahweh holds certain powers, and in ancient times only a few priests were allowed to pronounce the name. According to the secret Hermetic traditions that were recently released to the general public via the works of John Baines, to utter the name of Yahweh aloud would be to invoke the name of the Archon who played the dirty trick on Moses. Speaking this name aloud only further empowers this Archon, El Shaddai, the fearful and terrible God. As we have seen in addressing Moses, the deity informed him that he had appeared to his ancestors as El Shaddai. This El Shaddai name occurs in Genesis no less than 6 times, and is considered the descriptive title for the God of the Hebrews. The Hebrew root shaddad, from which it is believed to be derived, means to overpower, to treat with violence, or to lay waste. These meanings give the deity a fearful character, that of a devastator or destroyer. It is partly because the God of the Hebrews is known as an uncompromising and vindictive God. Shaddai may also be connected linguistically to the Assyrian word shadu, or mountain. In actuality, both of these meanings can be applied to the Hebrew god El Shaddai, for he is none other than the god of lightning and thunder of the Hittites, a northwestern version of the Sumerian god Ishkur and the Semitic Adad. He was the Anatolian mountain god and is often depicted with thunderbolts in hand. After the deluge, the Anunnaki started to rebuild the cities of Mesopotamia, and the lands known as the Fertile Crescent were divided among Enlil's offspring. Nanar Sin was given authority over all Mesopotamia and western lands except for Anatolia, which was assigned to Ishkur Adad, and Lebanon allotted to Utu Shamash. The goddess Inanna Ishtar moved her base of operations to Lebanon and ruled there with Shamash. The pantheon of the Levant consisted of 3 significant deities after the deluge: Adad, Shamash, and Ishtar. From Anatolia, the land of the Hittites, Adad extended his influence as far south as Jerusalem. This is illustrated in Ezekiel 16, where Jerusalem's origins are found in the statement, "Your father was an Amorite and your mother a Hittite." The lesser gods, the Nephilim and the angels. The Old Testament suggests that there were many deities, but these lesser gods seem to have descended to earth to interfere in the affairs of humans. This is explicit in Genesis 6, which states, "Now when man began to increase on earth, and daughters were born to them, the divine beings saw how beautiful were the human daughters, and took as their wives. It was then that the Nephilim appeared on earth, as well as later after the divine beings had united with human daughters to whom they bore children." The biblical term for these lesser deities seems to have been Nephilim. Is the descent of the Nephilim reflected in the literature of Mesopotamia? Could they be the Anunnaki, who also descended to earth in the antediluvian period? We shall see that these were different names for the same group of people. The term Nephilim has given theologians and translators problems over the centuries, so much so that today it is the policy to leave the word intact in modern translations. Nephilim is derived from the Hebrew Nephele, literally the fallen ones, or better still, those who drop down. It has been interpreted to mean fallen angels, in the sense of those who were cast down. The noted Jewish biblical commentator of the 19th century, Malbim, claimed that in ancient times the rulers of countries in the Middle East were the sons of deities who arrived on earth from the heavens. He maintains that they were the sons of pagan gods and called themselves Nephilim. Genesis asserts that they came down to earth in two groups. It was then that the Nephilim appeared on earth, as well as later. The descent of the two separate groups of Nephilim, or angels, down to Mount Hermon in northern Palestine is reported in the Book of Jubilees. A group descended in the days of Jared in the 10th Jubilee. Later, in the 25th Jubilee, another group came down to earth during the days of Noah. Since a Jubilee year is 50 regular years, this source claims that they descended to earth about 750 years apart. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian account of the creation, a group of Anunnaki also descended to populate the earth. These divine beings also intermarried with the daughters of man. The so-called angels of the Old Testament have become a general term to describe lesser deities who have been quite active in the affairs of man. In biblical Hebrew, the word often used is malach. However, other terms such as B'nai Elohim or sons of God are often translated as angels. It has been used as a cover term for any of the lesser deities coming in contact with humanity. These messengers got around very quickly by some sort of flying device, hence the representation of winged angels, a symbol of their ability to fly. This was the only way the ancients knew how to convey this fact. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah illustrates the power of these angels to fly about at will. As events unfold in Genesis 18 and 19, several angels were briefing Abraham on the coming destruction of the cities. The traditional translation states that when they decide to visit Sodom, they set out from there and faced Sodom. The distinguished biblical scholar E.A. Spicer, in his work Genesis, suggests that this translation is erroneous and could be more accurately rendered as they looked down upon the face of Sodom. This reading, of course, gives an entirely different meaning to the incident. Later, after the angels take Lot and his family to safety outside the city, the traditional text states, led him safely outside the city. Again, Spicer suggests an alternate translation of brought them out and deposited them outside the city. Thus, the revised text clarifies that the angels first reconnoitered the cities by air, then, seeing the necessity to rescue the relatives of Abraham, removed them by some sort of aircraft and deposited them outside at a safe place. The denizens of Eden, the legged snakes or reptiles. According to Genesis and other documents, and long before humans ever existed, the serpent, we shall call him that for want of a better word, for he is obviously a lizard, lived in the Garden of Eden and did all the necessary work to maintain it. This biblical serpent was not just a lowly snake. He could converse with Eve. He knew the truth about the tree of knowledge, and he was of such stature that he unhesitatingly challenged the deity. Additional information on this creature is available from other sources. Ancient Jewish legends describe the serpent of Eden as man-like. He looked like a man and talked like a man. This is further elaborated on in the Haggadah, that vast reservoir of stories that form the Jewish oral traditions. The section that deals with the creation described the serpent who inhabited the garden before the creation of Adam as an upright creature that stood on 2 feet and was equal in height to the camel. He is given many excellent qualities and mental abilities which are superior to that of man. In fact, the Haggadah states that his exceptional cognitive ability led to the ruin of humanity. The task of the serpent, according to this source, included supplying the deity with gold, silver, gems, and pearls, an obviously mundane commercial task for a group of supposedly spiritual beings. It is noteworthy that, again, we have that preoccupation with gems, as in Genesis, which describes the products of Eden. The gold of that land is choice. There is bdellium and lapis lazuli. Preceding man and then later cohabiting the Garden of Eden with him, the serpent was manlike in many ways. He was tall and stood upright on 2 legs. He did all the work of the gods, particularly the mining and agricultural work. And above all, the serpent had an intellect superior to man. These are all the attributes of the Anunnaki. The term serpent, as applied to this creature, raises many problems. It could best be described as a large lizard in modern-day times. The ancients may have given a different meaning to the word serpent, which today defines a legless reptile. In this respect, the problems are due to given modern meaning to the translation of the ancient word. For example, ancient or classical Greek had no word for serpent per se. The word drakon was applied to serpents as well as other fabulous snake-like creatures. In fact, compound words based on snake or serpent were variations of drakon. For example, the word for snaky or twisting like a road was drakonphorus. Dracontonia meant the slaying of a snake or serpent. In the Septuagint, the pre-Christian Greek version of the Hebrew Scriptures, the word drakon is used to denote snakes, large reptiles, and other large, terrible or ferocious creatures. In this way, the confusion of dragon and serpent led to mythological creatures who were winged, legged, and fire-breathing. The serpents of the ancient world were later represented as large lizard-like animals with wings to denote their ability to fly about, a metaphor for some sort of aircraft, their ability to defend themselves by flame-throwing devices, or perhaps their dangerous rocket exhaust was transformed into the mythological appearance of a fire-breathing dragon. It is against this background that humanity is interjected into the antediluvian civilization of the serpent gods. The Sumerian cuneiform tablets are more significant in this matter. The Anunnaki, or offspring of the serpent gods, grew tired of performing all the boring or distasteful tasks and appealed to the chief god to alleviate their suffering. It is here that humanity enters upon the scene.